Long before the headlines, long before Detroit, long before the world whispered the word suicide, Chris Cornell had already learned what it meant to live inside two different worlds. One world belonged to us, the one that saw him as a rock god, a voice of a generation, a frontman whose range should not exist inside a human body. And the other world was the one he never escaped, the silent world. The world of childhood trauma, chemical storms, panic and shadows that followed him long before fame. The story begins decades before that hotel room in Michigan. Christopher John Boyle entered the world in 1964 in a family that looked stable from the outside and fractured on the inside. His father, Ed Boyle, worked as a pharmacist. His mother, Karen, worked as a bookkeeper. But behind closed doors, both battled alcohol dependency. Chris would describe his childhood as quiet, unstable, and emotionally distant, especially the relationship with his father, a silence that never left him. When he was 14, the marriage collapsed. The divorce carved a deep line through his life. He dropped the surname Boyle and kept only one, Cornell. But names do not heal wounds. They only hide them. At 12, searching for identity and escape, Chris tried drugs for the first time, cannabis at first, then LSD, and eventually PCP, a single bad experience that rewired his sense of safety. The panic hit like a tidal wave. He later learned the word for what he developed, agoraphobia. For nearly 2 full years, he barely stepped outside. No school, no friends, no sunlight, just fear, anxiety, and the early seeds of the depression that would follow him for the rest of his life. While other kids played outside, Chris stayed in his room, trying to keep his mind from collapsing in on itself. But one force cut through the fog: music. He found a way out through sound, first piano, then drums, and eventually a voice that would become one of the greatest the world had ever heard. He threw himself into music like someone trying to stay alive. To survive the outside world, he took any job he could get, scraping fish remains, working long hours as a docker, waiting tables, performing tiny gigs at night for spare cash. And then, in 1984, the lifeline appeared. A band called Soundgarden. At first, audiences rejected them. Chris would later laugh about it, saying, "People hated us." The shirtless, sweaty singer whipping his hair, screaming from the depths of his chest. It shocked audiences who had never seen anything like it. But the band grew sharper, heavier, better. Seattle was becoming the center of a cultural earthquake, and Chris Cornell stood right at its epicenter. By the early 90s, the world was watching. Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden, the band that carried the thunder. But before superstardom, grief struck with brutal force. Chris's closest friend, Andrew Wood of Mother Love Bone, died from a heroin overdose in 1990. The loss shattered him. Chris described it not as heartbreak, but as a breaking open, a wound that would never fully close. He created Temple of the Dog as a tribute, not as a project, but as a form of mourning, a way to keep Andrew alive for a little longer. And then came 1994, a year that changed everything. Super Unknown, #1 on Billboard, multiple Grammy Awards, and a song written in his basement, Black Hole Sun, which would echo across generations and define an entire era. From the outside, Chris Cornell was unstoppable. From the inside, the cracks were widening, because fame does not erase childhood wounds, and applause cannot cure panic or silence trauma. Behind the curtain, Chris was drinking heavily. By 16, he drank more than most adults. By his early Soundgarden years, colleagues said they had never seen anyone consume that much alcohol. But it was not just alcohol. Chris performed with brutal physicality, jumping, thrashing, throwing himself across the stage, and eventually the pain caught up. Doctors prescribed OxyContin, a powerful opioid. It dulled his physical pain, but destabilized everything else. Chris admitted the truth. He used the pills to turn off feelings he did not know how to sit with. By 2002, everything collapsed at once. His first marriage ended, Soundgarden broke up, and Chris spiraled into addiction and despair. He checked himself into rehab voluntarily. He stayed 2 full months, longer than required, and he left determined to rebuild his life. And he did. In 2004, Chris married Vicky Cornell, the woman who would become his anchor. They built a life filled with stability and simplicity, a home he never had growing up. They welcomed 2 children, Tony, born 2004, and Christopher Nicholas, born 2005. Friends described this period as the happiest Chris had ever been. He cooked for his kids, made them laugh, swam with them, tried to give them the childhood he never received. But trauma has gravity, and gravity always pulls. In 2013, a shoulder injury returned him to pain. Pain returned him to insomnia. Insomnia returned him to anxiety. And then came the prescription that would define the final chapter of his life, Ativan, lorazepam, a benzodiazepine known to cause dependency, confusion, disorientation, memory issues, and behavioral changes, especially dangerous for anyone with a history of addiction. According to Vicky, Chris changed. Some days he was present. Other days he seemed distant, slow, emotionally muted, or agitated without reason. The signs were subtle at first, and then unmistakable. And as Soundgarden returned to touring in 2017, the pressure, exhaustion, and medication mixed into a dangerous cocktail. The people closest to him felt something shifting, something fragile, even if they could not name it. Everything continued building toward a single night, a single show, a single moment in Detroit that would become the point where all timelines converged. The final 24 hours of Chris Cornell's life were about to begin. The final 24 hours of Chris Cornell's life did not begin in Detroit. They began long before, in exhaustion, injury, sleepless nights, and a prescription that quietly changed the way his brain understood danger. The night of May 17th, 2017, was supposed to be another stop in Soundgarden's reunion tour, a celebration, a victory lap of a band that had shaped an entire generation. But Detroit became something else. Inside the Fox Theater, thousands of fans gathered, expecting fire, nostalgia, and the unmistakable thunder of Cornell's voice. And at first, they got it. Chris walked on stage with the force of a man born to command crowds. His voice shook the room. The audience roared, but as the show progressed, something shifted. Some songs drifted into odd tempos. Certain lines were forgotten. Lyrics were sung out of order. Band members exchanged subtle glances. Chris walked off stage at one point without explanation. Not a dramatic exit, a confused one. A moment that felt off. A moment no one could interpret at the time. The fans saw a legend performing. The band saw a friend slipping through cracks. By the end of the concert, the applause was loud, but something underneath it felt wrong. When Chris returned to the MGM Grand Hotel a little after 11, he told his bodyguard, Martin Kirsten, that he wanted Ativan. He had already taken some earlier, but he insisted he needed more. Martin gave him 2 pills. Ativan, when used properly, can quiet anxiety. But when used in excess, it can distort judgment, amplify confusion, and alter impulse control. Shortly before 11:30, Chris called Vicky Cornell. She heard it instantly. The slurred speech, the heavy pauses, the strange detachment. She asked, "What did you take?" Chris answered, "An extra Ativan, maybe 2. But his tone carried something else. A distance, a foggy rhythm, a version of him she did not recognize. Their conversation grew tense. She grew afraid. Not of Chris, but for him. When the call ended, she knew something was wrong. By 12:15, Chris had stopped answering the phone entirely. Vicky called Martin, told him to check the room. He went to the door, knocked, called Chris's name, nothing. He asked hotel security to open the door. They refused. Policy. Martin kicked the door. Once, twice, until 6 blows shattered it open. The room was dim, and the silence inside was louder than any arena Chris had ever filled. In the bathroom, Martin found him on the floor, a resistance band attached to the top of the door. There was no pulse. This was the moment that would haunt everyone who loved him, a moment frozen in time. A moment that millions of fans would learn about hours later, unable to make sense of it. Emergency responders arrived around 1 a.m. They administered Narcan, not knowing whether opioids might be involved. There was no reaction. At 1:30 in the morning on May 18th, 2017, Chris Cornell was pronounced dead. But for the world to understand what truly happened, they needed the autopsy. The Wayne County medical examiner reviewed everything: the scene, the toxicology, the physical state of the body, the historical medical data. The conclusion was clear: suicide by hanging. But the details inside the report told a more complex story, a physiological one, a psychological one shaped not by a single decision but by months, even years, of subtle shifts. Toxicology revealed several substances, all at therapeutic or near therapeutic levels: lorazepam, butalbital, naloxone administered by paramedics, caffeine, pseudoephedrine, norp-pseudoephedrine. None were lethal. None caused an overdose. And the examiner stated plainly that none contributed directly to his death. The fractured ribs, consistent with CPR attempts, not with trauma, not with violence, no signs of a struggle, no defensive injuries, no head wounds, no markings suggesting foul play. This was not a homicide, not an attack, not an orchestrated event. It was a tragedy born from impaired judgment, emotional vulnerability, exhaustion, and a medication scientifically known to dull the brain's ability to perceive risk. And yet, controversy grew instantly. Former military man Randy Cody raised doubts online. Claims of financial inconsistencies, contradictions in public statements, the speed of cremation, and suspicion directed at the bodyguard. These theories spread like wildfire, fueled by confusion, fear, and the human tendency to look for villains when the truth is unbearable. But none of the claims matched forensic reality. Not one was supported by law enforcement. Not one was corroborated by medical documentation. Then an even darker theory surfaced, a viral narrative claiming that Chris and Chester Bennington were investigating child trafficking networks. But there were no files, no testimonies, no police involvement, no evidence of any kind, just grief, coincidence, and internet imagination. The official investigation found 0 indicators of homicide. What it found was far more human and far more tragic. Because the truth is that Chris Cornell had been fighting his entire life, long before microphones, long before fame, long before the word grunge even existed. And one of the few people who understood that war was Chester Bennington. Their connection went beyond music. They toured together. They shared stories of anxiety, trauma, and survival. Chester idolized Chris. Chris trusted Chester. He even chose Chester to be godfather of his son, Christopher. When Chris died, Chester broke in ways the world had never seen. He sang Hallelujah at the funeral, barely holding himself up, his voice shaking as though grief had weight. 2 months later, on what would have been Chris's 53rd birthday, Chester Bennington died the same way. For many, this seemed like evidence of conspiracy. For those who knew them, it was evidence of heartbreak. 2 men who spent their lives protecting others through music, and who could not always protect themselves. So why did Chris Cornell die? Forensic science gave the mechanism, but the world wanted the reason. Experts who reviewed the case pointed to 5 interconnected forces: untreated chronic depression, No antidepressants were found in his system. Ativan side effects, known to impair judgment, heighten confusion, and trigger impulsive behavior. Exhaustion, weeks of heavy touring and sleepless nights. Long-term trauma, childhood instability, anxiety, and deep emotional scars. Physical pain, the shoulder injury that brought insomnia back into his life. Add them together and the picture becomes clearer. Most professionals agree Chris did not make a calm, conscious decision to die. He was not in a rational state, not thinking with clarity, not himself. He was, in the words of one specialist, physiologically impaired, psychologically vulnerable, and emotionally overwhelmed. A single moment of confusion, a moment shaped by medication, exhaustion, and internal storms, became irreversible. But the story does not end with tragedy. Not for a man like Chris Cornell. He was more than a frontman, more than a voice, more than the darkness he tried so hard to outrun. Chris Cornell was a survivor, a father, a friend, a soul who carried storms with quiet grace. He left us Soundgarden. He left us Temple of the Dog. He left us Audio Slave. He left us a solo career built from raw honesty, and he left us a warning that even the strongest voices can be fighting battles the world cannot hear. But above all, he left us beauty in the darkness. And that is a legacy no autopsy can measure, no rumor can erase, and no time can silence. If stories like this one move you, if you believe every life has a truth worth remembering, then make sure you subscribe. It helps this channel keep every story alive, and it tells the algorithm that these voices still matter. Join us, subscribe now, and stay with us for the next chapter.